Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am so excited for my guest today, Sarah Peyton. I must tell you, I was telling Sarah before we started to record that I read her homepage and the introduction that she introduces herself with, and I loved it so much I asked her permission if I could just read that as an intro to you getting to know Sarah for our conversation today. So I'm going to read that to you because it's just so beautiful. She says, "Hello, I'm Sarah. I'm a neuroscience educator, constellations facilitator, certified nonviolent communications trainer, and author who invites audiences into compassionate understanding of the effects of relational trauma on the brain and teaches about how to use resonance to change and heal. But it wasn't always this way. This is I know it's going to resonate for so many of you. I used to struggle with brutal anxiety and depression. I was in constant battle with this savagely self-critical inner voice that told me I was worthless, stupid, and unlovable. And I know so many of you feel this way. Before I understood the science of how difficult events impact our automatic brain patterning and how trauma fragments our capacity for self-warmth, I thought I was just plain broken. But there's nothing wrong with me, nor with you. We make sense. No matter what challenging feelings we have, no matter how flawed our strategies are for trying to get our needs met, I am thrilled to share what I've learned about how trauma impacts the brain and how we can move into joyful relationship with ourselves and others through resonant healing. I dream of a world where all humans have a sense of belonging and mattering, where we treat ourselves, the planet, and the beings around us with gentleness and care. Do you have this longing too? If so, you're in the right place." Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Kristen. What a pleasure to be introduced in this way.
My heart is just like expanding with so much warmth and joy and compassion and tenderness. That felt so authentic and vulnerable to share. Yeah. So tell me about how you went from your inner critic, which said that you're unlovable, you're stupid, you're unworthy, to now this place of healing that you're on.
Oh, such a fun journey. When I was little, I was born in 1962. And when I was little, I remember being like 13 years old and thinking, oh, things are no good inside of me. And then trying to find psychology texts and things. And then I would be about between 10 and 13, 1975, approximately. The textbook said, whatever happened in the first 3 years of life is set in stone. You're screwed.
That's comforting.
It's like, oh no, I just have to live with this. So I'm laughing because, it's sort of horrific for a 13-year-old to be up against that. But I'm laughing because, of course, now we know that the brain changes so much with warmth. And the lacerating voices within us, they respond to being noticed and met with resonance. First of all, such an interesting thing about that word stupid, which so many of us use about ourselves. I certainly learned it from my father. He would call himself stupid. He didn't call me stupid. But because he called himself stupid, I would call myself stupid. And it turns out that we internalize our parents' self-critical voices. So we're always doing transgenerational healing work when we start working with the way that our brains treat us. And it's such a lovely thing to be able to do work that allows our brains to begin to treat us nicely.
Yes.
Just stop there and see where your interests take us.
Yeah. I just think this whole piece about we internalize, what we're around, our parents in particular, or primary caregivers, and this idea that your dad said, I am stupid. And this people here, I'm an idiot. I'm so stupid.
Yeah.
And that you internalize that and it becomes a belief. It becomes a way, and you're so afraid to show up because you think someone's going to think you're stupid.
Well, not just think, but they'll find out, right? It's like if we believe it, if we carry it as a conviction, we're just trying not to burden the world with our stupidity. And we're just trying to move as incognito as possible in order to not make more of a mess.
So how did you discover? So you read, and this sounds so much like me. I was reading the psychology books very young, and I'd be on spring break in college reading Man's Search for Meaning, and people are like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I had a thirst for this. So we're kind of persevering.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what a thing to read. That's beautiful that you found it when you were in college.
Yes, and I love his work. How did you start to discover neuroscience and the impact of healing body and brain, and where did that begin for you?
I had a really peculiar experience. My husband and I ended up kind of informally adopting a kid who was abandoned by his parents, who was about 15 years old and had a ton of trauma. And my sweet, sweet husband, actually, when he found out that the kid didn't have anywhere to live, he went down into our basement. We're in a 1-bedroom house. He went into our basement, which was completely unfinished, and he made a room for this kid. So this wonderful boy moved in with us with all of his trauma. I couldn't hug him. I would go to hug him, and he was a kid who needed hugs and loved hugs. I couldn't hug him. I was just like, my arms would stop. And I just figured, well, I'm stuck with it. It's just my brain. Nothing's ever going to change. And then I went to this nonviolent communication workshop, and people were like, choose something you think that you're struggling with that you don't think you don't have any hope about. Let's do some empathy for that. People started to guess my feelings and needs. Everything I'd met before then was advice. Everybody gave me advice about how I'm supposed to do it differently, or that it was dangerous to bring a homeless kid into the house, or he was going to murder us in our sleep. We got all kinds of stuff. But nobody was thinking in this way, which is really the movement into resonance, where each other's feelings make sense. And so people were like, I wonder if you're feeling scared. I described not being able to hug my son. I wonder if you're feeling scared and you just want protection for both of you. And just like making all these wonderful guesses for me instead of advice. I was sitting in a circle and everybody was focused on me. And I had this really intense experience. It was like a flashback. I mean, it was a bad thing, but not a bad flashback, if you know what I mean. Returned to being 3 years old. And I felt myself reaching out to hug my mother and my mom, who had so much trauma. Talk about transgenerational trauma and healing. She would stiffen when I would go to hug her. Such a sensitive kid. I didn't want to make burden on anybody. So I would just like stop my hugs before they even were an impulse. And that was what was in my body when I would try to hug my son. So the physical movement pattern disappeared. I left that workshop and I was like, holy crap, what the heck just happened? And I could go home and hug my son. I was like, this is wild. It was right at the time when interpersonal neurobiology, Daniel Siegel, and Matthew Lieberman's research was starting to be published about you name emotion and the amygdala calms. And I was like, wow, there's a whole world of interpersonal neurobiology. So I started to teach it, and the only place I was really teaching at the time was in a women's prison. And I was just doing volunteer nonviolent communication training in the women's prison, and they loved the neuroscience. So I tried to learn more so that they would nourish their interest and curiosity, and it just went from there into like, and not just women in prison are interested in love. This everybody who's got that scientific curiosity is like, oh, this is so cool. So I wrote a book, which is called Your Resonant Self, all about this journey of how the heck do we change the insides of our brains so that it's like walking into a warm, cozy, beautiful house that welcomes us home.
I love that. I'm sitting in it like, because I get the privilege of seeing you on Zoom as we record this podcast, and I feel I can see your environment, and it's like, oh yes, it's warm and cozy and inviting and soothing. So I'm like, oh, I love that metaphor. How do we begin if someone goes, well, I don't have that relationship with myself. I mean, I am in a shame spiral. I feel like I'm not worthy. I'm all the things you named. I am in a depressive state. I don't feel good about myself. Where does one begin to build this warm, cozy, compassionate home within themselves?
Oh, this is a wonderful question. It can go in so many different directions. There are many places to start. So I'll just name some of them. One wonderful place to start is by doing just one breath of warmth for the self a day. That seems to be a small enough ask. If we're coming from a really critical inner environment, then it can be hard to do even one breath. We can aim for one breath of neutrality instead of one breath of warmth. It can be like a step too far to get to that one breath of warmth. But moving towards one breath of neutrality, especially if we have a little bit of gallows humor about our own brain, it begins to allow us to have doubt about whether the inside of our brain is telling the truth. And in fact, the inside of our brain, if we've lived through difficult events, if our parents had trauma and then visited in various ways upon us, even if they were lovely, lovely people who never hit us or called us names, but still carried their trauma within them unhealed, we'll carry it forward. And so what the inside of our brains is telling us, when the inside of our brain says, Sarah, you're stupid, it's saying things are bad in here. And if I call myself stupid, I will be able to just admit that I'm wrong. And maybe the horrific internal onslaught will stop. So it's almost like all of our negative self-talk is a desperate and tragically ineffective way to try to manage the default mode network and its pain that's happening on the inside of the brain. We don't feel the physical pain of trauma so much in our bodies. We do if we had a car accident or if somebody hit us, and we can feel the after effects of that in our body. But the emotional trauma lives in our pain network without being located in any specific place in our body. So it's an unembodied pain experience, which makes it even worse because there's no way to say, oh, I have a broken arm, of course I'm in pain. What we start to learn to do is to say, oh, I was terribly alone as a child. No wonder there's all this pain running around in my brain. And it's not telling me the truth. I love to say the phrase, if your brain is being mean to you, it's not truth, it's trauma. So we start to create these seeds of doubt about whether or not our brain is telling us the truth. And this is a very good start. So 1 breath a day of warmth, or if you can't get to warmth, neutrality, and starting to create seeds of doubt to begin to carry with us the idea. I even sometimes put it on my bathroom mirror. It's not truth, it's trauma, so that I see it every day. And then the next thing is to begin to learn some of the neuroscience of trauma. And this is interesting and fun because it makes so much sense. It turns out that the amygdala, which is a little organ, if you put your fingers in front of your ears and point both of them inward, where they go in along that line is approximately where the amygdala is. Yeah, right in there, right in between your fingers. And in there are these organs called the amygdala that carry our trauma memories. Turns out that in order to keep us safe, our brains don't timestamp trauma memories. Our brains, the amygdala, doesn't have any chronological categorization at all. It just knows something bad has happened in response to this particular cue. Now, let's let loose the dogs of war inside of our own brains. The cycle of self-blame and of shame and emotion that we don't have very good words for in English, which I like the words alarmed aloneness, which takes us in the direction of understanding the impact of losing people. We have the word abandonment, but the word abandonment carries within it this idea that somebody set us down and walked away from us. Where alarmed aloneness strips away the idea that somebody has done it to us, but rather just acknowledges the experience of nervous systems when we are alone. We are not in any way made to be alone. We have surprising, subtle things that happen with our nervous system and our immune system and even our heartbeat and our blood glucose. Everything changes in response to whether we have a sense of being accompanied. As soon as we have a sense of being accompanied, the very makeup of our response to the world, the cellular response to the world in so many systems, changes. When we have a sense of being with people who care about us and to whom we matter, and sense of being safe with them, like they're not ruled by trauma and they're not going to suddenly lash out at us, then what happens is the blood starts picking up more oxygen. We become oxygenated, sense of safety and mattering. The immune system shifts gears from creating the cells that are the inflammation response, that are trying to respond to injury. It shifts from creating injury response cells to creating the cells that fight viruses and cancer. So interesting about COVID, our experience with COVID and our experience with isolation, that our natural movement away from contagion is to isolate, then in isolating, then we make ourselves even more vulnerable in our immune system. Such an interesting double bind for us as a world in these last 3 years. And our blood glucose levels are higher. When people go away from us, when we're alone, we have to take in more glucose in order to maintain homeostasis. And then another very subtle change that happens is with our ability to decode emotions. The fine muscles of the face and the eyes become engaged in relationship. And so we start to see the nuances of other people's facial expressions and to hear in their voices when our eyes focus on a human face. So if you're in danger, your eyes are darting everywhere, trying to make sure the environment is safe. You don't get to focus on a human face. But when we invite ourselves to focus on a human face, we're sending a message of connection and engagement and safety to our bodies. The muscles of our middle ear tighten to the sound range of the human voice. And we start to pick up the nuances of emotion in people's voices as well. So we are extraordinarily made for social connection. Oh, I remembered one more thing. The skin temperature of our hands falls when we're alone. Hands and feet falls, the extremities, skin temperature falls because we're trying to conserve body heat. But if we're warmly accompanied and we have people around us, the skin temperature of our hands and feet rises because we don't need to be conserving energy because we're in a shared resourcing. So this, of course, is very interesting information for those of us who live through the kind of trauma that makes us feel like people are not safe. And so many of us do. And in fact, the lovely neuroscientist who studies some of these subtle differences, whose name is James A. Cohen, is his name, Coan, amazing man. What he discovered is that if we don't trust people, then we don't get the same benefit. So we get to trust ourselves. If you're listening to Sarah right now and you're going, I don't feel those things when I'm with people. I feel tense when I'm with people. And you do. It's true. You've got very good historical evidence for that. And part of the healing journey takes us into a differentiation of the people who hurt us from all people. And we start to be able to come toward people with an openness, judge them on their present day behavior rather than prejudging them on our past experience. So that's a part of the healing journey, is that our bodies begin to feel more safe with people and start to be able to experience these subtle, nuanced changes.
So beautiful. I'm just like taking it all in. Here's a couple of things that stood out to me that you were sharing that I thought were really important. I love this idea of alarmed aloneness versus abandonment. That's a very important distinction. How can someone start to begin piece that out, the difference between alarmed aloneness and abandonment?
Well, we can ask ourselves. One of the lovely and strange things that neuroscience has discovered is that when we use our own name, again, if it feels kind and warm to use our own name, if our parents only used our name to scold us, then, but if we can get to that warm place, or at least the neutral place, then we can say, Sarah, I wonder, do you need any acknowledgement of alarmed aloneness? And if your body relaxes at all, then you go, oh, that was a body, yes. And you can say, do you need any acknowledgement of abandonment? And once you get this differentiation, then you start to go, oh, no, I don't think there's anybody who's left me. I don't feel abandoned, but I do feel alarmed aloneness. And we can, of course, feel alarmed aloneness for decades, in part because we don't have good words to talk about it and nobody talks about it. And as Matthew Lieberman showed with his research about the amygdala, when we actually give the right name to emotional experience, the amygdala relaxes and the body relaxes. The tension in the amygdala in his experiments would fall by half when people would name the right emotion. So if they were feeling alarmed aloneness and they said, I feel angry, there would be no change in the amygdala. When we name the correct emotion, our body actually respond to it. It's very odd. And then he was like, why doesn't everybody do this? And he did another experiment where he said to the people, do you believe that if you name your emotion, you're going to relax and feel better? They all said, no.
Yeah, they're like, no, sorry, Bob, that does not.
And that's because I think he didn't speculate, but my speculation is that that's because we manage this state of not naming our emotions. We manage our lives in a world where it's not okay to name emotions by not naming them. And as soon as we start to name them, we begin to feel them. And this can be alarming because as we've been going along in this sort of blind pattern of being in alarmed aloneness for several decades, and all of a sudden Sarah says, do you need any acknowledgement of alarmed aloneness? Or would it be sweet if someone understood how much alarmed aloneness you experience? And we go, yes. And then we go, dang it, here it is. All these decades of alarmed aloneness, now I have to grieve. And that's really good for our bodies, but it's not exactly fun.
How do you support yourself or someone else through that? Because as a therapist, people do get very flooded and overwhelmed, maybe some repressed or unprocessed emotions.
Right. One of the things that I find is that whenever we are able to convey an understanding with each other, that we make sense, that there's a context for our feelings, that because so many times when we're children, we're just told that feeling is wrong. So we just have this sort of embedded, lived sense that if we're angry, we really shouldn't be angry. Or if we're sad, we really shouldn't be sad because it's a burden on our mother. Or if we're afraid, we really shouldn't be afraid because the bullies will then take it out on us. We need to look like we're not afraid ever. And now I'm having sort of this spike of grief about our human condition, and I've forgotten what the question was. What was the question?
So someone can feel very overwhelmed or flooded by the emotion, which we know is a way the body's releasing. It's no longer holding on to, so it can be very healing for the body and overwhelming for the person. How do you support or walk alongside yourself or someone else in that process?
Context, context, context. Of course you have. Of course you felt alarmed aloneness for decades. Do you need some acknowledgement that the people that were around you when you were little were so traumatized themselves that they could not turn towards you? They couldn't see you. They didn't know you had needs. They didn't know they had their own needs. You need some acknowledgement that you have very good historical reasons, lived historical evidence that you were alone. Or if somebody's really angry, like, yeah, of course you would be angry. Is it because you love justice so much? Is your love of justice so intense and so huge that there's a rage for a better world, for example? Or you just follow, and this is what folks who live in the world of therapy, I think, are so good at, understanding their clients, understanding the context of their clients' lives, and being able to say, well, does it feel like it came from this context of your childhood, of being so alone? Is there some way that we can reach out to that little one who lived so alone and let them know that things are slightly different now? Let them know that there are people who listen and care about how you feel now. It's an interesting journey because we live in a culture where whenever anybody has a feeling, we tend to give advice, which actually creates a spike of cortisol in human bodies. It's a way that we're leaving each other alone. It's a little experience of alarmed aloneness to receive advice, unsolicited advice, when we express a feeling. Cortisol is the main emotion for the panic grief circuit, which is where alarmed aloneness lives. They have a number of different emotional circuits, and they all have their own neurotransmitter profile. And cortisol is stress, our entire stress. It's very interesting to begin to wonder, is all of this stress that people live in, is it really a manifestation of us not knowing how to be safe with each other so that we can relax and experience the subtle changes that are so protective against stress? It's almost like we could speculate that the entire human race, with the level of stress that we are in now, the entire human race is struggling with some aspect of alarmed aloneness.
I think that is 100% true. At least in my clients and probably a lot of listeners listening have experienced that. Seems like it's a universal.
Yeah.
Alarmed aloneness can be a universal emotion at some point.
Profoundly made to be social.
Exactly. There's so many places I want to go, but I really want to hear about the circuits.
Oh, okay.
Would that be something you could share? Because I know there's different, the anxiety might be a circuit, I'm guessing. Depression might be a circuit. Shame might be a circuit. Am I understanding?
Oh, they're also interesting when it comes to the circuit. This is the work of Jaak Panksepp. He's a lovely researcher, Panksepp. He died several years ago. He was the one who developed basic emotions theory, which is that our bodies are having a lived experience that is going to be a shared experience between us and all social mammals. That everybody, all the little animals who live in groups, have emotions that make sense, and as do we. You can hear the distress cries, baby mice if one of them gets lost and they're calling for their mom, or baby seal when the mom comes back that's alarmed aloneness. They're calling out with alarmed aloneness. We're made to call out with our experiences of alarmed aloneness. Okay, so we have, Panksepp said, we have 7 circuits of emotion. And they are, I'll see if I can do them without looking at any research.
That's okay. If we just get the gist of it, that's fine.
There's a care circuit, which is where we love each other and want to take care of each other and nurture our children and nurture people that are dependent upon us. There is a seeking circuit, which is the foundation of everything, which is our drive to find food and make money and gain information. So if you're learning new things on this podcast and you're feeling satisfied and happy, we've got a good flow of dopamine going in your seeking circuit. So the seeking circuit. And then we have the fear circuit, which is something scares us, or which can be physical danger. It can also be financial danger. It can be pretty dang scary. And then we've got the rage circuit, which is a very interesting and fabulous circuit. The only way to manage the rage circuit without using the care circuit to mitigate and support it is by turning down all of the life energy in all the circuits. So turning down the rage circuit can indeed be a contributor to depression, but it's not the only contributor to depression, because the main thing about depression is the panic grief circuit, which is where alarmed aloneness lives. If I had to visual, I would draw you a picture of it, but I'll try to describe the picture. The picture is we experience alarmed aloneness, and as we experience alarmed aloneness and it's not resolved. So, for example, this is really clear with a baby who's got a depressed mom. The baby needs connection. The mom has postnatal depression. The mom cannot respond. The baby reaches and then finally reaches a state of metabolic exhaustion, which takes the baby toward death. The way the baby manages the metabolic exhaustion without dying is to go into a collapse in which they don't have to feel the metabolic exhaustion anymore. This is depression. This is the work of Panksepp and Douglas Watt. Incredible work. Because we don't talk about alarmed aloneness as a society, people tend to just prescribe drugs and think there's something wrong with the brain. The thing about the depression is that it's not alarmed aloneness, it's a protective, enclosed capsular state, which is protective against alarmed aloneness. So it's a bit like if you think of Snow White in the glass coffin, that's depression. She's not feeling anything. Anhedonia, loss of color in the world, loss of motivation, no ability to take care of the self, everything is too much, total exhaustion. We're in that coffin. So that's the big relationship with the circuits and depression is alarmed aloneness, panic grief, then stopping the movement towards death and just going into the coffin. It can be something people do really early if they have a mom who's in postnatal depression. It's one of the big indicators of a kind of a lifelong struggle with depression because we have that state as a go-to.
It's embodied in the nervous system.
I think I got 6 of them. Play and sexuality.
That's what I was going to say. Where's sex in there?
Yeah, play and sexuality. Really fun to explore. And then I added disgust. People were asking Panksepp to add disgust as a circuit before he died, and he refused. But if you look at the work of Paul Ekman, whose work I love, about facial expressions, there's this definite facial expression of disgust. So I think we need to name it because it's got its own facial expression. So I add disgust. So I say there are 8 circuits. And then naming them and working with them creates enormous movement for clients. It's odd to ask ourselves to become explicit about naming tracts of emotion, but it's really important. Anxiety, you had mentioned, anxiety actually occurs both in panic grief and in fear. So when somebody says anxiety, we don't yet know what actual circuit is activated. It's really helpful for us to understand that the indefinite emotion words don't actually do any resolution for the amygdala.
Really?
Yeah, so if we say worried, concerned, disturbed, perturbed, troubled, anxious, these are all non-specific emotion words. which can be a lot easier for clients to manage because, again, remember Matthew Lieberman's research? No, I don't want to name actual emotions. So it's really nice for us to begin to track that this is a superficial level. This list of nonspecific emotion words is a superficial level of connection, and that the actual change for the amygdala happens when we get the right circuit named with real clarity and definition.
So look at the core emotions, the 7 core emotions.
Yeah.
How does that tie in, which are joy, sexual excitement, fear, anger, disgust? Do I have them all?
I don't know. It's not the piece of
Okay, that's the neuroscience on the core emotions. How does that tie into the circuits?
They each belong to a circuit.
Each of those core emotions belongs to a circuit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I could see where sexual excitement would be in the sexuality circuit, right?
And joy is in play, and excitement is in seeking, and
anger is in rage,
and fear is in fear, and grief and sorrow and shame and alarmed aloneness are all in panic grief.
That makes sense. So when we think of these circuits, you used a word, accompanied was the word you used. And I want to take the words because I think they mean something in the healing journey when we're working with the circuits.
Yeah, they really
explain accompanied. Is it accompanied? Am I saying it correctly?
It is a lovely term. And what it means is that over some amount of time, there's enough resonance that the therapist working with a client and you're accompanying them, then over time you're creating enough resonance and enough naming of emotional experience that the client begins to internalize the therapist as an auxiliary part of their own brain, which is what we do with each other. Whenever we meet somebody who is a resource and a therapist is a resource, then if there's a safe relationship, then we begin to bring that person inside of us. So we're walking down the street, we're beating ourselves up, and we go, oh, my therapist, George, he would say, of course you're beating yourself up. You lived through terrible trauma and you learned how to do that to try to take care of yourself. Is that anything like what's happening, Sarah? And I go, oh, yes, thank you, internal George. So this is accompaniment, is resonance over time, is the experience of somebody being able to be with us and us being able to take them in.
Now, let's say someone says, well, I don't have a therapist and I don't really have somebody. I always do this with my inner child. I acknowledge, I listen, I offer empathy and compassion. Would that be an accompaniment too?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I wrote my book, which is How You Found Me. I wrote the book, Your Resonant Self, because I know from firsthand experience what it's like to not have humans feel safe enough to be able to trust them to talk about anything. So I thought, can I write a book that lets people do a little bit of this journey on their own and start to get to a point where they would be able to work effectively with a therapist or an empathy buddy or a class or anything that's a healing part of the journey. And so that's what the book offers, is how do you begin to bring some warmth to yourself in the experience of having a brain that's been impacted by adverse childhood experiences.
I wish we could give this book out like it was candy. So if you're resonating with this conversation, please go get Your Resonant Self, please. I mean, this is a book, you need it. And if you're a parent, I just need to say, I see you, I'm with you. Or you're in a parent-like role, whatever that looks like, a teacher, a coach. It's so important to do this, your own healing work for your family system. I'm very passionate about generational trauma. Can you share a little bit about, as a parent, how did this help your son? How did your work transcend to him and did it? And I just was curious.
Well, he was such a lovely man. We got to keep him with us for 15 years. He lived to be 30, and then he died of alcoholism from the childhood trauma. I was working so hard to try to figure this stuff out, and that's a whole nother story. But as I was traveling around the world with the book, Your Resonant Self, before the pandemic, of course, what I noticed was that people out of integrity would not be able to give themselves self-warmth. And I think this is a really interesting thing to end with and to close on, is the understanding that we make contracts with ourselves not to be good with ourselves, not to be good to ourselves, in order to be in integrity. Very strong, unconscious, deep contracts. You're probably thinking, what do you mean integrity? So like, I will not be kind to myself in order to stay with my mother who is not able to be kind to herself. I will not be kind to myself in order to make my father's words about me true so that I can have a father. I will not be kind to myself because the world is full of people who are in pain and I don't want to leave them. These very deep unconscious contracts are, I think, some of the contracts that my son was living with, and I hadn't figured that out before he died of alcoholism. But he was so lovely. He was such a lovely man. And our relationship was beautiful, even while he was dying. And he put my husband and me on his hospital board as his parents.
He invited you into this deeper work.
He did.
I mean, from what I'm gathering, I was like, what beautiful. He ushered you through this, and you listened, and you took the call, and this has set you on this path to do this transformational, life-changing work.
Absolutely.
So,
and the first book is dedicated to him.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And I know that takes a level of vulnerability. So I appreciate you sharing authentically about that. And I just want to say thank you for your heart, the work you're doing, and the dedicating the first book to your son. Wow. I mean, I can feel his presence just in us talking. So where can people find you if they're interested in working with you or learning more?
On my homepage at www.sarahpeyton.com. If you hit the Start Healing Now button, you'll sign up for my email welcome series. You'll receive a free chapter from my first book and be led through a bunch of free meditations, videos, and practice exercises explaining the foundational concepts of resonance and how to use it to change and heal your brain.
Oh, please, everyone, go put your name in, get your chapter, get the meditations. You're doing life transformational work. Thank you for your heart and your time and being on the Close the Chapter podcast. It really was a tender place for me. And this is one of my favorite interviews just because you offered so much tenderness. And I feel that, and that feels authentic. And I just want to say thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And go get the book. It's on Amazon, because I know that's where I found it, on Amazon. Is it in bookstores too?
It's in bookstores, and you can get it from your favorite online bookseller.
I love that. Yes.
Independent. Yeah.
So go get it. Thank you so much, Sarah, and be well.
Oh, thank you, Kristen.
Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week, and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, Boice.com. Thanks, and have a great day.